Welcome to our channel, a place where mysterious stories from history are told in a calm and gentle voice, allowing you to explore the past while letting your mind relax and drift into a deep sleep. Tonight, we will uncover one of the most mysterious and controversial deaths in history, the passing of Alexander the Great. He died at only 32 years old, shortly after conquering nearly the entire world known to the Greeks. But what truly happened in those final days of the undefeated king? This story will be divided into 5 chapters, each exploring a different angle. From the uncertain writings of ancient historians to theories of illness and poison, and even the political conspiracies whispered within the royal court. Together, we will follow each clue, each detail, and see why, even after more than 2,000 years, the mystery has never been solved. So join me on this journey, a tale told slowly enough to lull you into calm, yet intriguing enough to hold your attention. And if you would like to continue traveling with us through the quiet mysteries of history, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Now then, let us begin. Picture this. It's 323 BC, and Alexander the Great, the young man who bulldozed half the known world off the map, marches into Babylon. Now, let's clear something up right away. This isn't the legendary Hanging Gardens version of Babylon your high school history teacher mumbled about while you tried not to fall asleep. In fact, archaeologists still argue whether the Hanging Gardens ever existed or if they were just ancient Mesopotamian clickbait. But Babylon itself? Very real. A mega-city with massive walls, bustling streets, giant temples, and most importantly, endless supplies of booze and banquets. Alexander, only 32 years old at the time, was the ruler of an empire stretching from Greece and Egypt all the way to India. Think of him as a young, overachieving CEO who just scaled his startup into a global monopoly, but without a board of directors to rein him in. And yes, this CEO had a serious drinking problem. Not sip a little wine at dinner drinking, but full-on binge-drinking marathons. The Greeks even had a word for it: symposium, basically an ancient frat party where men drank until they dropped while trying to outdo each other with deep, philosophical TED Talks. If you've ever seen a friend get drunk and suddenly start rambling about the meaning of life, congratulations, you've just recreated classical Greek culture. In Babylon, Alexander threw parties like it was his full-time job. One of his last feasts, according to Plutarch and Arrian, went on for 2 days straight. Just imagine. The man who had never lost a battle, who crossed deserts and toppled empires, collapsing not on the battlefield, but at the dinner table. That's right. The legendary death of Alexander may have come not from an enemy's sword, but from a shiny golden cup. But here's the real question. Did he die from illness, from poison, or simply from one too many all-nighters with wine? Before diving into the theories, we need to set the stage with what was happening in Babylon during those final days. Babylon wasn't just any city. It was the old capital of the Persian Empire, filled with sprawling palaces, 100-foot-high walls, and artificial canals linked to the Euphrates River. Put Alexander into that setting, and you can almost see him, a guest who just conquered the mansion, now moving in and throwing one rager after another. What no one expected was that this luxury backdrop would become the stage for his downfall. The Greeks themselves believed Babylon was unclean. Ancient accounts mention its hot, humid climate, swarms of insects, and outbreaks of diseases, especially malaria, a mosquito-borne disease causing fever and chills, and typhoid fever, a nasty bacterial infection from contaminated food and water. Either one could easily bring down even the strongest man. Yet, when ancient writers described Alexander's death, they weren't exactly scientific. Their version goes something like, "The king had a fever, couldn't speak, and died a few days later." Basically, it reads like a bad Yelp review of the flu, except it ended an empire. And yes, his empire fell apart almost instantly. Imagine a multinational corporation where the CEO suddenly logs out permanently without leaving a will or succession plan. That's exactly what happened. Alexander didn't just die. He left behind a centuries-long royal family soap opera. If Hollywood were scripting the end of Alexander the Great, they'd probably stage his death on a battlefield. Swords clashing, dramatic speeches, thunder in the background. Instead, reality went with a less glamorous option. A dinner party gone wrong. According to Plutarch, one of the most famous ancient biographers, Alexander attended a grand banquet hosted by his close friend and admiral, Medius of Larissa. Now, Medius wasn't just anybody. He was basically that one friend who always knows where the next party is and somehow convinces you to go, even when you know you should stay home. Only this time, the party didn't end with a hangover. It ended with history's biggest leadership crisis. The feast reportedly lasted all night. Some sources say Alexander drank from a giant bowl containing neat wine, meaning wine without any water mixed in. To us, that might not sound shocking. But in the ancient Greek world, drinking undiluted wine was like showing up at a dinner party today and downing a bottle of vodka straight from the bottle. It wasn't just reckless. It was borderline barbaric. Greeks always mixed their wine with water, both to make it last longer and to keep people from becoming, well, exactly what Alexander became. Dangerously drunk. After this marathon of drinking, Alexander supposedly cried out in pain. Some accounts even dramatize it as an agonizing scream after swallowing from a large cup. He felt a burning sensation inside his body, staggered, and had to be carried back to his quarters. Ancient gossip immediately jumped to the idea of poison. I mean, come on. Drinks from a cup, screams in pain, collapses? It sounds like every murder mystery you've ever read. But here's where it gets tricky. The logistics of poisoning Alexander weren't simple. He was constantly surrounded by guards, attendants, and loyal companions. Slipping him poison without anyone noticing would have been nearly impossible. On top of that, ancient poisons weren't exactly instant kill substances. Most were slow-acting. Think days or even weeks, unless someone had access to exotic toxins. Historians have speculated about everything from arsenic to strychnine, but there's no hard evidence. Still, the story of poison stuck, largely because it made sense politically. Alexander had been acting more and more like a tyrant in his final years, demanding divine honors, executing old comrades, and marrying into conquered dynasties. Plenty of people around him had reasons to want him gone. The generals who would later carve up his empire, men like Ptolemy, Seleucus, and Cassander, didn't exactly benefit from Alexander living another 30 years. Poison made for a neat, if somewhat melodramatic, explanation. But back to the banquet. After the mysterious drinking episode, Alexander's health spiraled downhill. Over the next several days, he developed a high fever, severe weakness, and eventually lost the ability to speak. Imagine the man who once roared commands across battlefields, now reduced to barely whispering, unable to lift his own head. Ancient writers say that when his soldiers filed past him one last time, many wept, not just from loyalty, but probably from realizing that without this one man holding everything together, the empire was about to collapse into chaos. Some modern doctors who've studied the symptoms have suggested typhoid fever or West Nile virus as possibilities. Typhoid, caused by contaminated food or water, can produce a slow, painful decline, with fever, abdominal pain, and delirium. West Nile, carried by mosquitoes, could also explain the fever and weakness, especially in a swampy city like Babylon. Either way, it's not as glamorous as poison, but much more plausible. Yet, in the eyes of ancient historians, poison was a far juicier tale. After all, Who wants to believe the greatest conqueror of antiquity was taken down by bad water or a mosquito bite? It's like telling people Napoleon died of stomach ulcers. True, maybe, but not nearly as exciting. If you've ever played the game Telephone as a kid, you'll understand ancient history. One person whispers a story, the next person retells it slightly differently, and by the time it reaches the end, the details have mutated into something absurd. Alexander's death is basically one long game of ancient telephone. Let's start with Plutarch, 46–120 AD. Writing centuries after the fact, Plutarch gives us the classic drama version. Alexander attends the banquet, drinks from the big cup, collapses in pain, and then deteriorates day by day. In his account, Alexander lingers for about 11 days, growing weaker until he finally dies. Plutarch was not a doctor, not a scientist, and frankly not even interested in what really happened. His goal was moral storytelling. He wanted to present Alexander as a tragic figure, a man undone by excess, hubris, or fate. It's less a medical report, more a morality play. Next up, Arrian, 86–160 AD. Arrian's Anabasis of Alexander is often considered one of the more reliable sources, since he based his work on earlier eyewitness accounts like those of Ptolemy and Aristobulus, both men who actually knew Alexander. But here's the catch. Arrian barely mentions the death itself. For him, Alexander's military campaigns were the real story, and the details of his final illness? Kind of a footnote. Arrian admits there were many rumors, but basically shrugs and says, well, nobody agrees. Thanks for nothing, Arrian. Then there's Diodorus Siculus, 1st century BC. His version is the most suspicious. Diodorus gives us the poison narrative, complete with whispers of a conspiracy among Alexander's generals. He claims that wine was used to hide the poison, and that Alexander's agony began immediately after drinking. Sounds juicy, right? The problem is, historians today think Diodorus was more interested in entertaining than reporting. He was the kind of writer who couldn't resist adding extra seasoning to the story. And then we have Justin, a Roman historian. His account also leans into conspiracy, specifically blaming Antipater, one of Alexander's top officials in Macedonia. According to Justin, Antipater's sons were right there in Babylon and may have slipped the poison. Again, convenient, dramatic, and, let's be honest, almost too perfect. It reads more like a Netflix script than an objective report. So what do we get when we line up these sources side by side? Plutarch, it was a slow, tragic decline. Arrian, hey, not my problem, moving on. Diodorus, he was poisoned at a banquet, scandal. Justin, definitely poisoned, by Antipater's family, done deal. It's a mess. And to make things worse, all of these accounts were written long after Alexander's death. None of them come from a direct, unbiased eyewitness. The closest sources we have, like Ptolemy, yes, the same guy who later became king of Egypt, are long lost, and what remains has been filtered through layers of retelling. This means one frustrating truth. The more you read, the less certain you become. Was it poison? Was it disease? Was it exhaustion from years of non-stop war, drinking, and stress? Every ancient historian picks the version that best fits their agenda. And because of that, modern historians and doctors are still left squinting at the evidence, trying to piece together the medical puzzle. But one thing is crystal clear. Alexander's death was treated like the fall of a god. Soldiers mourned, the empire panicked, and writers scrambled to make sense of it. And the way they told it, with drama, conspiracy, and contradiction, guaranteed that the mystery would live on far longer than Alexander himself. For over 2,000 years, historians argued about Alexander's death like fans debating the ending of a TV series. But in the last century, a new group joined the discussion. Doctors. Yes, physicians, Epidemiologists and toxicologists decided to put Alexander on the autopsy table, metaphorically, of course, since the actual body has never been found. Yes, his tomb is also missing, but that's a mystery for another night. So what do the modern experts say? Let's look at the main suspects. 1. Typhoid fever. This is the most popular medical theory. Typhoid is caused by a nasty bacterium called Salmonella typhi, usually spread through contaminated food or water. If you've ever traveled abroad and your doctor warned you to avoid the tap water, this is why. Symptoms include high fever, abdominal pain, weakness, and sometimes delirium. Sound familiar? Ancient sources describe Alexander as having a persistent fever and losing strength day by day, which lines up pretty neatly with typhoid. The killer detail? Typhoid can last about 2 weeks, which matches Plutarch's report that Alexander lingered for 11 days before dying. In other words, Alexander may have been the most famous victim of food poisoning in history. 2. Malaria. Another strong candidate. Babylon's climate was swampy, humid, and buzzing with mosquitoes. Malaria, carried by Anopheles mosquitoes, was rampant in the region. Malaria causes fever cycles, chills, sweats, and in severe cases, organ failure. If Alexander picked up malaria while celebrating outdoors or while bathing in the Euphrates, it could explain his rapid decline. The problem? Malaria often causes recurring fever spikes. The ancient accounts describe a steady deterioration, not the on-again, off-again fever typical of malaria. So, while possible, it doesn't quite match. 3. West Nile virus. A more modern theory. West Nile virus, also carried by mosquitoes, reached scholarly debates after outbreaks in the Middle East during the 20th century. It can cause fevers, headaches, fatigue, and, in rare severe cases, paralysis or death. Alexander losing his ability to speak and move could fit this profile. It's a stretch, but still in the running. 4. Autoimmune disorders or Guillain-Barré syndrome. Here's where things get nerdy. Some neurologists suggest Alexander might have suffered from Guillain-Barré syndrome, GBS, a rare disorder where the body's immune system attacks the nerves. The result? Muscle weakness, paralysis, and sometimes respiratory failure. Why this theory? Ancient accounts say Alexander stayed fully conscious even as his body shut down. His soldiers reportedly walked past his bed, and he acknowledged them with a nod or faint gestures. If true, this sounds eerily similar to locked-in syndrome, where the mind is awake but the body is paralyzed. Creepy, right? 5. Poison again. Of course, we can't leave poison off the list. Modern toxicologists argue against it because most poisons of the time, like hemlock, arsenic, or aconite, would have killed much faster. 11 days of slow decline doesn't fit the poison profile, unless it was something exotic and carefully dosed. But again, without a body to test, we're stuck with speculation. So, what's the verdict? Most medical historians lean toward typhoid fever. It's the simplest explanation that checks most of the boxes. High fever, prolonged illness, eventual death. But because he died of typhoid doesn't sound as thrilling as he was assassinated in a drunken plot, the conspiracy theories have refused to die. And here's the irony. Alexander, the man who survived countless battles, endless marches, and even crossing the Persian deserts, may have been defeated not by an enemy, but by a microscopic bacterium in a dirty cup of water. Talk about anticlimactic. On June 10, 323 BC, at least according to most sources, Alexander the Great finally slipped away in the royal palace of Babylon. He was 32 years old. Let that sink in. 32. Today, that's the age when most people are still figuring out student loans and whether they should switch careers. Alexander? He had already carved out one of the largest empires in history, but his death was not glorious. Ancient writers describe a hushed palace where his generals, companions, and soldiers crowded in for one last glimpse. Imagine the scene. A man who had commanded armies from Greece to India, now lying powerless, his body broken, barely able to move. Some accounts say he could no longer speak. Yet when his soldiers filed past him, he lifted his eyes or gestured faintly with his hand. To the men who worshipped him as a living god, it must have looked like divinity itself refusing to bow to death, even as his body betrayed him, and then he was gone. No farewell speech, no final order, just silence. The problem? Alexander left behind no clear heir. His only son, Alexander IV, wasn't even born yet. Roxana, his Bactrian wife, was pregnant. He had another potential heir, Heracles, an illegitimate son by Barcine, but illegitimate children in royal dynasties rarely had a good shot at the throne. So who was supposed to inherit the empire? The story goes that on his deathbed, when asked who should succeed him, Alexander whispered, "To the strongest." In Greek, that's toi kratistoi. It's poetic, chilling, and, frankly, sounds exactly like the kind of line a Hollywood screenwriter would give him. The problem? We don't know if he actually said it. Some historians think it was made up later by the generals to justify their free-for-all power grab, because that's exactly what happened next. A free-for-all. Within hours of his death, the palace was a battlefield of politics. Generals and nobles fought over the throne, the succession, and even what to do with Alexander's body. His empire, which he had spent 11 years building, began crumbling the moment he stopped breathing. And the body, oh, the body, became its own mystery. Supposedly, Alexander's corpse did not decompose for days, which many took as proof of his divine nature. Others suspected that his body had been preserved with honey or special oils. Modern scientists have even suggested this might support the theory of Guillain-Barré syndrome. If he was in a coma-like state, he may have still been alive when they thought he was dead. Yes, that means there's a terrifying possibility. Alexander might have been buried alive. Sweet dreams. His generals, the Diadochi, a fancy Greek word meaning successors, quickly turned Babylon into a political cage match. Perdiccas, one of his top commanders, took control as regent. Ptolemy, another general, quietly schemed to steal Alexander's body and bring it to Egypt, which he did, by the way, turning it into one of history's most famous missing tomb stories. And Cassander, the son of Antipater, remember him, the guy rumored to have poisoned Alexander, eventually eliminated Alexander's wife and son to secure his own power. So in the end, Alexander's death wasn't just the end of one man. It was the spark that lit decades of civil wars, betrayals, and assassinations. His empire fractured into pieces, ruled by the very men who might have had the most to gain from his sudden demise. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe the real answer to Alexander's mysterious death lies not in fevers, poisons, or medical theories, but in the ambition of the people who stood at his bedside, waiting for him to stop breathing. Death, for most people, is the end of the story. For Alexander the Great, it was just the beginning of the sequel. The moment he breathed his last in Babylon, his body instantly became the most valuable object in the ancient world. Why? Because in an age where power was all about symbolism, whoever controlled Alexander's corpse could claim to control his empire. In other words, the body was the crown. At first, his generals tried to play it nice. The official plan was to prepare an elaborate funeral carriage, not just any carriage, but a rolling temple on wheels. Picture this: gilded columns, jeweled decorations, and a golden canopy, all designed to carry Alexander's embalmed body back to Macedonia, where his ancestors were buried. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of a $10 billion state funeral with a motorcade, only with oxen instead of limousines. And here's the kicker: his body supposedly didn't decay. Ancient writers insisted that days, even weeks after his death, his flesh was still fresh, his face serene, his features intact. To the Greeks and Macedonians, this was proof he was divine. To modern science, it's either a sign that his body was extremely well embalmed, or, as some terrifying doctors suggest, that he wasn't quite dead yet when they started the embalming process. Sleep well with that thought. But before the grand funeral could happen, politics barged in. Perdiccas, Alexander's appointed regent, wanted the body shipped back to Macedonia to strengthen his claim as the protector of Alexander's son and heir. Meanwhile, Ptolemy, one of Alexander's most cunning generals, had other plans. He knew that possession of the corpse meant legitimacy, and he wasn't about to let Perdiccas grab all the glory. So what did Ptolemy do? He stole it. Yes, you heard right. The future ruler of Egypt pulled off history's greatest body snatching. As the magnificent funeral carriage was trundling its way west, Ptolemy intercepted it, seized Alexander's body, and rerouted it south to Egypt. There, he laid it to rest in Memphis, and later in Alexandria, where it became the centerpiece of his dynasty's propaganda machine. Imagine the audacity, turning your dead boss into a tourist attraction. And guess what? It worked. Ptolemy secured his power base in Egypt, founded a dynasty that lasted nearly 300 years, and cemented Alexandria as the cultural capital of the Mediterranean. Meanwhile, the other generals were left bickering over a map, while Ptolemy had the ultimate trophy. But here's where the mystery deepens. Because after centuries of being displayed, venerated, and visited by emperors, Julius Caesar and Augustus both made pilgrimages to see Alexander's body, the tomb suddenly vanished. By late antiquity, it was gone. No one knows where Alexander the Great's body rests today. Was it destroyed? Hidden? Looted? Or is it still buried somewhere beneath modern Alexandria, waiting to be found? So, in the strangest twist of all, Alexander may have conquered the world, but lost the one thing every emperor wants: a permanent grave. His death was mysterious enough, but his missing tomb? That's a whole new chapter of historical conspiracy. If Alexander's death was mysterious, his burial site turned into a full-blown legend. After Ptolemy hijacked the body and brought it to Egypt, Alexander's corpse became both a political trophy and a holy relic. In Memphis and later in Alexandria, he was placed in a grand mausoleum called the Soma. Think of it as a cross between the Taj Mahal and a tourist hotspot, except the tourists included Roman emperors. According to ancient writers, the tomb became a must-see destination. Julius Caesar, when in Egypt, made a personal pilgrimage to gaze upon Alexander's embalmed body. A century later, Augustus, the first Roman emperor, not only visited but supposedly touched Alexander's corpse. Some accounts even say he accidentally broke the nose off the mummy while doing so, proving that even world conquerors are not safe from clumsy tourists. For centuries, the tomb stood in Alexandria as a symbol of power. It wasn't just a grave. It was propaganda carved in marble. Any ruler who wanted legitimacy would associate himself with Alexander. To stand by his tomb was to borrow his aura of greatness. And then it vanished. By the 4th century AD, references to the tomb grow fuzzy. Some say it was destroyed in riots. Others blame earthquakes, floods, or even early Christians who dismantled pagan monuments. By the time the Arab conquest of Egypt rolled around in the 7th century, no one knew exactly where Alexander lay. The most famous man in antiquity had become the owner of history's most famous missing grave. Naturally, this sparked centuries of speculation. Medieval travelers swore they had seen it. Arab historians claimed the body had been secretly reburied in a mosque. Treasure hunters chased rumors across Alexandria's ruins. And modern archaeologists? They're still looking. Excavations in Alexandria regularly attract headlines with "Possible Tomb of Alexander Found," only for hopes to fizzle when it turns out to be a regular old Hellenistic burial site. The irony is brutal. Alexander built an empire stretching across 3 continents, but in death, he left behind a mystery so big we still haven't solved it. His empire was carved up, his legacy rewritten, and his tomb, the one thing meant to immortalize him, simply evaporated into the sands of time. And here's the kicker. The fact that no one can find the tomb keeps Alexander more alive than ever. Every missing clue, every failed excavation, only fuels the myth. In a way, his vanishing grave has turned him into an eternal ghost, haunting the history books. When the facts go missing, myths rush in to fill the gap. And Alexander's missing tomb? It became a magnet for every kind of story imaginable, from religious miracles to outright fantasy novels. 1. The Islamic and medieval legends. In the Islamic world, Alexander was often identified with Dhul Qarnayn, the 2-horned one, a mysterious figure mentioned in the Quran. Why 2 horns? Because ancient coins often showed Alexander wearing ram's horns, a symbol of the Egyptian god Amun. Over time, this image merged with religious traditions, transforming Alexander from conqueror into a sort of divinely guided ruler who traveled to the ends of the earth. Some medieval Muslim historians even claimed Alexander's body had been secretly reburied under a mosque in Alexandria, so that he continued to watch over the city. Pilgrims swore that prayers at this hidden tomb brought blessings, as though Alexander had become a saint. Not bad for a man who spent most of his life burning cities to the ground. 2. Christian and Renaissance fascinations. Early Christians, suspicious of pagan hero worship, may have dismantled the Soma in Alexandria. But ironically, Alexander's legend kept seeping back into Europe during the Middle Ages. By the Renaissance, he was reinvented as the ultimate model of a secular king, ambitious, brilliant, and tragically mortal. Humanist scholars debated his virtues and flaws, while artists painted him as a Christ-like figure, radiant and eternal. In some versions, the disappearance of his tomb wasn't an accident, but an act of divine will, God hiding the body to remind humans that even the greatest empires crumble. A moral lesson disguised as archaeology. 3. Modern treasure hunters and conspiracy theories. Fast forward to the modern age, and Alexander's missing tomb is still a full-blown obsession. Every few years, archaeologists in Egypt or Greece announce they've found promising evidence. Spoiler alert, they haven't. But the hope never dies. Conspiracy theorists have gone further. Some claim the body was smuggled out of Alexandria during antiquity and lies hidden under the Vatican, a secret trophy of Rome. Others insist it's buried beneath the streets of modern Alexandria, waiting for someone with enough funding and luck to dig in the right spot. There are even fringe theories that Alexander never died in Babylon at all, that his body double was buried while the real king escaped east. That one's basically ancient fan fiction, but it shows just how much the mystery fuels imaginations. 4. Why the myth refuses to die. Why do these legends persist? Because Alexander's tomb isn't just a missing archaeological site. It's a symbol of unfinished history. As long as his body is missing, Alexander hovers between man and myth, both conqueror and immortal. And honestly, the mystery is part of the allure. If archaeologists found the tomb tomorrow, sealed with his body inside, the headlines would be enormous. For about a month. Then the legend would be over. But as long as it's missing, Alexander lives on in the collective imagination, forever young, forever unconquered. When Alexander's heart stopped beating in Babylon, the real battles had only just begun. The empire he built stretched from Greece to India, but he left no clear instructions about who was supposed to inherit it. It was the ancient equivalent of a billionaire dying without a will, leaving lawyers, children, and distant cousins to tear each other apart in court. Only in this case, the court had tens of thousands of soldiers, siege weapons, and egos the size of continents. The problem of no heir. At the time of his death, Alexander had no adult son. His wife Roxana was pregnant, but the unborn child, Alexander IV, wouldn't be able to rule for years. His only other son, Heracles, was illegitimate, and in the brutal politics of monarchy, illegitimate usually meant expendable. So who would take over? Alexander's generals, gathered around the dying king's bed, supposedly asked him who should succeed him. And here we arrive at one of history's most famous and most suspicious last words. According to legend, Alexander whispered, "To the strongest." In Greek, toi kratistoi, it's brilliant, dramatic, and absolutely useless as an actual succession plan. Imagine your boss dies and leaves the company not to a named successor but to whoever's toughest. That's not leadership. That's the Hunger Games. Of course, some historians doubt he ever said this. More likely, it was a convenient slogan invented later to justify the brutal power grabs that followed. Because if you're about to start a civil war, it helps to claim the dead king totally wanted it this way. The first division of the empire. Right after Alexander's death, a tense council was held in Babylon. The generals were split into two camps. Perdiccas, Alexander's top commander and regent, argued that they should wait for Roxana's child to be born and declare him king, with Perdiccas ruling as regent in the meantime. Translation: the baby will be king, but I'll actually run the empire. You're welcome. Meleager, representing the common soldiers, pushed for Alexander's half-brother Aridaeus, who was alive, male, and conveniently present in Babylon. The problem? Aridaeus was mentally disabled. Ancient sources describe him as simple-minded, likely suffering from a developmental disorder or epilepsy. Not exactly ideal emperor material. In the end, they compromised, badly. They declared a joint kingship. Philip III Aridaeus, the half-brother, and Alexander IV, the unborn son. Perdiccas would serve as regent until the baby was born. On paper, it looked like unity. In reality, it was like duct-taping two broken pieces of pottery together and pretending you had a vase. The generals eye their prizes. Behind all the ceremonial titles, Alexander's generals, known as the Diadochi, or successors, were already sizing up the empire like hungry wolves circling a carcass. Ptolemy wanted Egypt. Seleucus was eyeing Babylon in the east. Antigonus looked toward Asia Minor. Cassander, the son of Antipater, waited in Macedonia for his turn. Each man had armies, ambition, and zero intention of letting anyone else tell him what to do. The so-called unity of the empire was an illusion. Alexander's greatest legacy, it turned out, wasn't a single empire, but decades of blood-soaked civil wars that would reshape the Mediterranean world. So in the end, Alexander's death did not pass the crown to the strongest. Instead, it lit the fuse for one of the most chaotic succession crises in history. The man who conquered the known world left behind generals who couldn't even conquer their own greed. If you thought Alexander's empire might peacefully survive under a regent and two puppet kings, think again. The ink on the so-called Babylon settlement wasn't even dry before Alexander's generals started plotting each other's downfall. It was less a government and more like a mafia sit-down. Everyone smiling, shaking hands, already calculating who to stab in the back first. The spark of war. The first showdown came between Perdiccas, the regent, and his supposed allies. Perdiccas was ambitious. Too ambitious. He didn't just want to protect the throne, he wanted to be the throne. And in the dangerous world of ancient politics, ambition had a funny way of turning friends into corpses. When he tried to strengthen his position by marrying Alexander's sister, Cleopatra, the other generals saw what he was up to. If he married into the royal bloodline, Perdiccas could claim the throne outright. And that was a big no-no for men like Antipater, Ptolemy, and Antigonus, who weren't about to serve under another Alexander wannabe. The first betrayals. Tensions exploded when Perdiccas decided to march on Egypt, where Ptolemy had stolen Alexander's body and set himself up as governor. For Perdiccas, this was personal. Not only had Ptolemy humiliated him by hijacking the royal corpse, but controlling Egypt meant controlling the empire's richest province. The campaign was a disaster. Perdiccas bungled the Nile crossing, lost thousands of men to crocodiles, and finally faced mutiny within his own ranks. His officers, sick of his arrogance and poor decisions, assassinated him in 321 BC. Just like that, the regent of the empire was dead, cut down not by his enemies, but by his loyal companions. Lesson learned. In the world after Alexander, your worst enemy was usually the man standing right next to you. A free-for-all. With Perdiccas gone, the thin facade of unity collapsed completely. The empire was carved up like a Thanksgiving turkey. Ptolemy tightened his grip on Egypt, smiling smugly over Alexander's stolen body. Antipater held Macedonia and Greece, though his death would soon spark another round of chaos. Antigonus the One-Eyed became the dominant figure in Asia Minor, earning his reputation as the most ruthless of the bunch. Seleucus rose to prominence in Babylon, laying the foundation for what would become the Seleucid Empire. And the supposed kings? Philip III, Aridaeus, and the infant Alexander IV? They were little more than hostages, dragged around as mascots for whichever general wanted to pretend he was fighting for the royal family. Imagine toddlers and disabled relatives being used as medieval brand logos for armies. That was the level of cynicism on display. The human cost. Meanwhile, the soldiers, the very men who had marched across deserts with Alexander, who had fought under his banners for over a decade, were forced to kill each other. Brothers in arms, turned against one another by the ambitions of their leaders. To them, the dream of Alexander's empire must have felt like a cruel joke. One minute they were conquering the world, the next they were pawns in a civil war with no end in sight. The death of Alexander didn't just spark political squabbles, it unleashed decades of bloodshed that would eventually shatter his empire into pieces. The wars of the successors were not one war, but a rolling storm of battles, assassinations, betrayals, and backroom deals that lasted for nearly 40 years. By the end, not one of Alexander's original heirs would survive. For all his military genius, Alexander the Great made one fatal mistake. He left behind a family. And in the cutthroat politics of the successor wars, being related to Alexander was less a blessing than a death sentence. Roxana and the Baby King. Let's start with Roxana, Alexander's Bactrian wife. By all accounts, she was stunningly beautiful and dangerously ambitious, not exactly a safe combination in the war zone that followed Alexander's death. Shortly after giving birth to Alexander IV, the posthumous son of the conqueror, she took swift action to secure her child's position. Her first move? Eliminating the competition. Alexander had two other wives, Statera II, daughter of the defeated Persian king Darius III, and Parysatis II, daughter of the Persian king Artaxerxes III. Both were threats to Roxana's influence, and so Roxana invited them to a friendly meeting and had them quietly executed. No fuss, no drama, just efficient royal housekeeping. So much for sisterhood. Philip III Aridaeus, the puppet king. Then there was Alexander's half-brother, Philip III Aridaeus. He had been crowned as joint king alongside Alexander IV. But let's be honest, the man was a puppet. Ancient sources describe him as mentally disabled, likely suffering from epilepsy or another neurological condition. He was propped up on the throne, a crown on his head, while the generals fought wars in his name. But even puppets can be dangerous, at least symbolically. By 317 BC, Cassander and his rivals were playing the legitimacy game so viciously that Aridaeus became expendable. Enter Olympias, Alexander's mother. Olympias, the mother from hell. If there was one person you didn't want as your enemy, it was Olympias. She was fiercely protective of her son's legacy and utterly ruthless. When she regained power briefly in Macedonia, she ordered the execution of Philip III Aridaeus and his wife Eurydice. According to some sources, Eurydice was forced to commit suicide in public, a grim reminder that royal women were pawns until they became threats, at which point they were swiftly eliminated. Olympias ruled in her grandson's name, but her triumph was short-lived. Cassander, son of Antipater, marched into Macedonia, captured her, and, after a show trial, had her executed in 314 BC. The mother of Alexander the Great, once the most powerful woman in the Greek world, was stoned to death by her enemies. The fate of Alexander IV. That left only one potential heir. Alexander IV, the boy who never got the chance to rule. For years, he lived as a hostage under the watchful eyes of Cassander, who pretended to be his protector while waiting for the right moment. That moment came around 310 BC. When the boy was about 13 years old, Cassander ordered his quiet execution, along with Roxana. No spectacle, no public trial, just the quiet snuffing out of the last legitimate heir to the empire. With their deaths, the Argead dynasty, which had ruled Macedonia for centuries, was extinguished. The dynasty that conquered the world, extinguished. And so, in less than a generation, Alexander's family tree was pruned with surgical precision. Wife, brother, mother, son, all gone. The man who conquered the known world left behind an empire carved into bloody shards, and not a single living descendant to inherit his name. The irony is cruel. Alexander dreamed of a united empire, blending Greeks and Persians into one people. Instead, his death created a vacuum so violent that his own bloodline was obliterated. When Alexander was alive, his generals followed him across deserts, through endless battles, even into India, a living god they could rally behind. Once he was gone, they looked at one another and realized, why serve under someone else when I can be king? The result? 40 years of chaos. Civil wars so tangled that even Game of Thrones looks like kindergarten politics. The first round of war. The initial carving up of Alexander's empire, the so-called Babylon settlement, had been shaky from the start. By 322 BC, cracks were showing everywhere. Antigonus the One-Eyed controlled Asia Minor and dreamed of more. Ptolemy held Egypt and smiled smugly over his prize, Alexander's stolen body. Seleucus rose in Babylon with ambitions stretching eastward. Cassander, lurking in Macedonia, bided his time. The empire wasn't one kingdom anymore. It was a pack of warlords, each claiming legitimacy, each sharpening their knives. Perdiccas falls, chaos rises. The first major casualty was Perdiccas, the regent. After his humiliating defeat in Egypt against Ptolemy, remember the crocodiles and the failed Nile crossing, his officers turned on him and hacked him down in 321 BC. It was the first of many betrayals, and set the tone for the wars that followed. Generals didn't just fight their enemies. They killed their own side the moment it was convenient. With Perdiccas gone, new coalitions formed. Alliances in this era lasted about as long as a bowl of Babylonian wine. Today's best friend was tomorrow's battlefield corpse. The rise of Antigonus the One-Eyed. Of all the Diadochi, Antigonus Monophthalmus, the One-Eyed, was the most ruthless. He quickly established himself as the strongest warlord, defeating rivals in Asia Minor and building an empire of his own. His nickname, by the way, wasn't poetic. He literally had only one eye, lost in battle. And yet somehow this made him even more terrifying, the scarred veteran who seemed impossible to kill. By the 310s BC, Antigonus controlled most of Asia, while his son Demetrius earned the flashy title the Besieger, Poliorcetes, for his mastery of siege warfare. If Alexander had left a slogan, "To the strongest," Antigonus was doing his best to prove he deserved it. Ptolemy, the survivor. Meanwhile, down in Egypt, Ptolemy played a different game. He didn't chase empire-wide dominance. Instead, he dug deep into Egypt, fortifying his rule, building Alexandria into a cultural capital, and parading Alexander's body like a holy relic. Ptolemy was the classic survivor, cautious, pragmatic, and perfectly happy to let others burn themselves out, fighting for the whole empire while he quietly built one of history's most enduring dynasties, the Ptolemies, which would last until Cleopatra VII 3 centuries later. Seleucus and the eastern frontier. Out east, Seleucus was laying the groundwork for his own kingdom. Originally one of Perdiccas' officers, he switched sides at the right moment, classic move, and secured Babylon. From there, he expanded east into Persia, founding the Seleucid Empire, which would dominate the Near East for centuries. Seleucus was less flashy than Antigonus or Ptolemy, but his staying power made him one of the ultimate winners of this blood-soaked free-for-all. Cassander and the butchering of the bloodline. Back in Macedonia, Cassander eliminated the last shreds of Alexander's dynasty. Roxana, the young Alexander IV, even Olympias. With the royal family gone, Cassander crowned himself King of Macedonia. He had no legitimacy except his ruthlessness, but in the Diadochi era, that was enough. The world after Alexander. By the 310s, the dream of a unified empire was dead. In its place rose 3 great kingdoms: Ptolemaic Egypt, Seleucid Asia, Antigonid Macedonia, though it would take more wars for this one to stick. But they weren't stable. Each king still fantasized about reuniting Alexander's empire under his own rule. The wars kept rolling on, shifting alliances, colossal battles, endless betrayals. Soldiers who had once marched together under Alexander now slaughtered one another in the name of their generals' egos. The cruel irony? Alexander had conquered the known world in 11 years. His successors spent 4 decades tearing it apart. By 301 BC, 2 decades had passed since Alexander's death, and his generals were still at it, brawling like spoiled heirs fighting over an inheritance the size of 3 continents. At the center of it all stood Antigonus the One-Eyed, the most ambitious of the lot. While others carved out kingdoms, Antigonus wanted the whole empire. He wasn't satisfied with a piece of the pie. He wanted to eat the entire thing. The build-up. Antigonus controlled Asia Minor and much of the eastern Mediterranean. His son, Demetrius, the besieger, was a military rock star, famous for his dramatic sieges and even more famous for his love of luxury. Father and son together looked unstoppable, but the other successors realized that if they didn't team up, Antigonus would swallow them one by one. So, an unholy alliance formed: Seleucus from the east, Lysimachus from Thrace, Cassander from Macedonia, and Ptolemy from Egypt. These men hated each other, distrusted each other, and probably would have preferred stabbing each other in the dark. But against Antigonus, they made common cause. The armies. The scale of the coming clash was immense. Ancient sources suggest Antigonus and Demetrius fielded about 70,000 infantry, 10,000 cavalry, and a terrifying 75 war elephants. The coalition, led by Seleucus and Lysimachus, brought 64,000 infantry, 10,500 cavalry, and, wait for it, 400 war elephants. Yes, 400 elephants. Seleucus had imported them from India, and they were about to decide the battle. To put it bluntly, Ipsus wasn't just a showdown between generals. It was the Jurassic Park of ancient warfare. The clash. The battle began in classic Hellenistic fashion: phalanxes advancing, cavalry charging, dust clouds rising. Demetrius, leading the Antigonid cavalry, smashed into the enemy lines with his usual flair. At first, it looked like he might break them. But here's the fatal mistake. Demetrius chased the fleeing cavalry too far from the field, and while he was off playing hero, Seleucus unleashed his elephants, Hundreds of them, lined up like a living wall of armor and tusks, blocked Demetrius' return. Imagine trying to ride back into battle only to find a stampeding zoo standing in your way. Cut off from his son's cavalry, Antigonus' infantry was surrounded. The old general, over 80 years old by then, fought bravely to the end. But arrows rained down, and the man who had once dreamed of ruling Alexander's empire fell dead on the field of Ipsus. His vast ambitions died with him. The aftermath. The Battle of Ipsus permanently shattered the dream of a united empire. After Ipsus, Alexander's world was officially carved into separate kingdoms. Seleucus took most of Asia, founding the Seleucid Empire. Lysimachus grabbed Asia Minor and Thrace. Cassander kept Macedonia, for now. Ptolemy held Egypt, smug as ever with Alexander's body on display. Demetrius escaped, humiliated but still alive, destined to keep causing trouble for years. But his father, Antigonus the One-Eyed, became the most famous casualty of the successor wars, the last man who had truly tried to put the empire back together. The end of a dream. Ipsus wasn't just a battle. It was the funeral of Alexander's vision. The empire that had stretched across 3 continents was now fractured beyond repair. The successors had proven that they could inherit Alexander's armies, his strategies, even his elephants, but not his unity. From this point on, the Hellenistic world was a patchwork of rival kingdoms, powerful, wealthy, influential. Yes, but never again one empire under one king. Alexander may have died young, and his empire may have shattered into rival kingdoms, but the culture he spread outlived them all. In fact, you could argue that Alexander's most lasting conquest wasn't military at all. It was cultural. Greek everywhere. The first and most obvious legacy was language. Greek, specifically Koine Greek, a simplified Common Greek dialect, became the international language of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East. Traders in Egypt, scholars in Babylon, bureaucrats in Syria. They were all writing and speaking in Greek. Think of it like the ancient version of English today. Not everyone loved it, but if you wanted to do business, science, or diplomacy, you needed it. A Babylonian scribe might curse under his breath about these Greek barbarians, but he still had to file his tax records in Greek. Alexandria, the new capital of the world. Thanks to Ptolemy, the city of Alexandria in Egypt became the crown jewel of the Hellenistic age. Founded by Alexander himself, but built up by the Ptolemies, Alexandria wasn't just a port city. It was the Google, NASA, and New York City of antiquity rolled into one. Its Library of Alexandria aimed to collect every book in the world. Ships docking at the harbor were forced to hand over their manuscripts, which were copied, sometimes stolen outright, and added to the collection. Its museum, from the Greek musion, place of the muses, gathered scholars, poets, scientists, and philosophers. Imagine Einstein, Shakespeare, and Elon Musk all stuck in the same research campus, fueled by olive oil and ego. Its lighthouse of Pharos, one of the 7 wonders, symbolized the city's global importance, guiding ships, merchants, and ideas into the Mediterranean hub. Science, philosophy, and weird inventions. In the Hellenistic kingdoms, knowledge blossomed. Euclid wrote The Elements, the most influential math textbook in history. Archimedes played with levers, pulleys, and war machines, while also reportedly yelling Eureka in the bath. Eratosthenes measured the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy, using nothing more than shadows and geometry. Doctors in Alexandria performed dissections on human cadavers, pushing the boundaries of anatomy. Creepy, yes, but groundbreaking. Of course, not everything was genius. Some inventors wasted time on mechanical toys, automatic wine pourers, and coin-operated holy water dispensers. Then again, maybe that makes them the ancestors of both vending machines and Las Vegas slot machines. East meets West. Alexander's conquests created a cultural mashup unprecedented in history. Greek art blended with Persian luxury, Egyptian religion, and Indian influences. Statues of Buddha in Gandhara, modern Pakistan, suddenly looked suspiciously Greek, wearing togas and with wavy Mediterranean hair. In turn, Eastern spices, philosophies, and astronomical knowledge made their way west. It was globalization, 2,000 years before the word existed. A world changed forever. Even though the generals squabbled and murdered each other for decades, the world they created was connected in ways it had never been before. The Hellenistic age was messy, violent, and unstable, but it was also vibrant, creative, and revolutionary. Ironically, Alexander's empire didn't survive politically, but culturally, it never died. From the Mediterranean to the Indus River, the shadow of Greek ideas stretched long after the man himself turned to dust. Alexander died in 323 BC, but if you think that ended the story, think again. His death became a canvas, and every era painted its own version on top of it. Depending on who you asked, Alexander was either poisoned, struck down by disease, or chosen by the gods to ascend into immortality. And like any good mystery, the lack of clear evidence made the story more seductive, not less. The ancient spin doctors. We've already seen how ancient historians couldn't agree. Plutarch gave us the tragic slow death, Diodorus offered the juicy poison plot, and Arrian basically shrugged. Each writer twisted the story to suit their audience. For the Greeks, Alexander's downfall was a lesson in hubris. For the Romans, who admired strong rulers, it was a tragedy of fate. Everyone projected what they wanted to see. Medieval transformations. By the Middle Ages, Alexander's death had turned mythological. In Christian Europe, some chroniclers painted him as a warning, a man who flew too close to the sun, punished by God for arrogance. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, he was folded into the legend of Dhul-Qarnayn, the two-horned one, a ruler guided by divine power who traveled to the ends of the earth. The inconvenient details of fever and vomiting? Edited out. Legends prefer clean narratives. The Renaissance and Enlightenment reboot. During the Renaissance, scholars rediscovered the classical texts and turned Alexander into a philosophical case study. His death was dissected like a Shakespearean tragedy. Was it poison? Was it the price of excess? Was it simply the randomness of mortality? Enlightenment thinkers, obsessed with rationality, leaned toward natural causes. Malaria, typhoid, bad water. Suddenly, Alexander wasn't a demigod undone by fate, but a human being undone by germs. The story shifted from epic poetry to proto-science. Modern medicine joins the plot. In the 19th and 20th centuries, historians teamed up with doctors, and suddenly Alexander's death was treated like a cold case file. Theories of typhoid, malaria, and Guillain-Barré syndrome entered the picture, each with its own set of medical footnotes. Scholars published papers with titles like The Final Illness of Alexander the Great, as if the man had just checked into a Victorian hospital ward. And yet the poison theory never died. Why? Because it's sexy. Because humans love conspiracy more than bacteria. Tell someone Alexander was killed by Salmonella typhi, and they'll yawn. Tell them he was assassinated by his ambitious generals with an exotic Eastern poison, and they'll lean in. Why the mystery persists? At its core, the death of Alexander is unsolvable. We have no body, no autopsy, no contemporary account that's reliable. And that, ironically, is why it's immortal. The mystery has survived because it can never be resolved. Each age reinvents it to reflect its own anxieties: ancient hubris, medieval morality, Renaissance philosophy, modern science. In other words, Alexander didn't just conquer the world. He conquered time itself by refusing to die in one definitive way. Some deaths fade quietly into the footnotes of history. Alexander's? It became a stage prop for 2,000 years of storytelling. His mysterious end wasn't just a historical puzzle. It was a cultural Rorschach test. Every age and every medium projected its own fears, hopes, and obsessions onto his death. In literature, from epic to tragedy, medieval romances turned Alexander's death into the climax of a chivalric saga, complete with poison plots, dramatic speeches, and divine omens. Renaissance playwrights borrowed the story as a cautionary tale of ambition and downfall. In 19th and 20th century novels, Alexander's death was often framed as an unsolvable enigma, a symbol of human limits. Writers loved the open-endedness. Was he poisoned by friends? Betrayed by ambition? Struck by disease? The ambiguity made him perfect for drama. It's no coincidence that so many retellings of Alexander's life stop not at his conquests, but at that mysterious deathbed in Babylon. On screen, the Hollywood problem. Hollywood couldn't resist Alexander, but cinema has always struggled with the ending. Take Oliver Stone's Alexander, 2004. The film tried to mix spectacle with mystery, hinting at conspiracy while never quite settling on one answer. Critics complained it was messy, but honestly, how could it not be? The real story is messy. Other depictions choose the Shakespearean angle, the dying hero surrounded by weeping generals, whispering cryptic last words. Never mind that ancient sources disagree on whether he said anything at all. A silent death doesn't sell tickets. In politics, borrowed glory. Strangely enough, Alexander's death has also been a political talking point. Modern leaders, from Napoleon to Mussolini, invoked Alexander's name not just for his conquests, but also his mortality. The message was clear. Even the greatest men die young. Therefore, seize glory now. Others used his end as a warning. Hubris brings downfall. Excess brings ruin. In Cold War rhetoric, some even compared Alexander's empire to a superpower stretched too thin, destined to collapse once the leader was gone. His death became a metaphor for overreach, arrogance, or fate, depending on who needed the lesson. Pop culture and conspiracy junkies. In our own age, Alexander's death thrives in documentaries, podcasts, and YouTube deep dives. Every few months, some new theory pops up. Exotic poisons, genetic diseases, secret murders. The internet ensures the debate never ends because nothing fuels clicks like an unsolved mystery involving a dead superstar. Even fringe communities get in on the act. Some conspiracy buffs insist his body is hidden in the Vatican, or in secret tunnels beneath Alexandria, or even spirited away by Freemasons. If you think that sounds absurd, well, yes. But absurdity sells. Why culture can't let go? The reason Alexander's death keeps showing up in art, film, politics, and conspiracy forums is simple. It's unfinished. Unlike Caesar's assassination, which had daggers and names attached, Alexander's death is a blank page. A slow fever, a poisoned cup, a divine calling, everyone gets to write their own ending. And in that way, the conqueror who once imposed his will on the world still exerts power. He didn't just build an empire in life, he left a story that refuses to die in death. So here we are, more than 2,300 years after Alexander the Great collapsed in Babylon, and we still don't know why he died. Fever, poison, disease, exhaustion, divine punishment, every theory has its supporters, and none can be proven. On the surface, that might feel unsatisfying. We like neat endings, clear answers, a tidy historical autopsy. Alexander refuses to give us that. But maybe that's the point. The fragility of power. In life, Alexander was the ultimate symbol of unstoppable force. A man who never lost a battle, who redrew the map of the known world in a decade. Yet in death, he was as fragile as any of us. Whether it was a mosquito bite, a bacterium in the water, or too much wine at a banquet, Something invisible and ordinary toppled the mightiest empire of antiquity. The mystery reminds us that power, however vast, is never immune to mortality. The story bigger than the man. And yet, Alexander's death outgrew the medical details. It became a mirror. For the ancients, it was a cautionary tale about hubris. For medieval chroniclers, it was a parable of divine judgment. For modern historians, it's a case study in disease and empire. Each retelling says less about Alexander himself and more about the people doing the telling. The mystery isn't just his, it's ours. Immortality in uncertainty. Ironically, the fact that we don't know what killed Alexander may be why he's never really died. Caesar was stabbed, Napoleon had stomach cancer, Lincoln was shot. Closed cases. But Alexander? He lingers, not as a body in a tomb. That, too, is missing, but as a question mark echoing across centuries. In a way, his death achieved what he always wanted in life: immortality. Not in marble or monuments, but in the endless retelling of his story. The final thought. So perhaps the real mystery isn't what killed Alexander the Great, but why we keep asking. We ask because we need stories like his. Stories where history blurs into legend, where fact slips into myth, where the end is never the end. Alexander conquered the world in 11 years. He's been conquering our imagination ever since. And so, we have reached the end of our journey with Alexander the Great. From the endless banquets in Babylon, to the mysterious fever, to centuries of speculation about what truly ended his life. Perhaps we will never know the final answer. But maybe that is why his story still lives on, somewhere between history and legend. If you are still awake, thank you for staying with me until the very end. And if you've already drifted into sleep, that's perfectly fine too. For while Alexander never truly found rest, you certainly deserve a peaceful night. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next quiet journey into the mysteries of history. Stories just intriguing enough to spark your imagination, yet calm enough to carry you gently into dreams.